the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
They were one of the smoothest sounding, best looking musical acts of all time, and were emblematic of the feel-good peace and love portion of the 1960s folk music scene. But before Peter, Paul, and Mary started making memorable melodies like If I Had a Hammer and Where Have All the Flowers Gone, they never really knew each other, and probably wouldn't have formed the group that still draws crowds to this day, minus Mary, of course, who passed away in 2009, without the help of a couple of other guys named Bert and Bob. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Jazzed About History. Today, we're going to be talking about Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Bob. It all got started on January 29, 1962, when Peter Yarrow, Noel Paul Stuckey, and Mary Travers signed their first and only recording contract with Warner Brothers Records. The trio was the product of a vision first hatched by Greenwich Village promoter Albert Grossman, who helped to found the famous Newport Folk Festival in nearby Rhode Island, and who had observed the success of artists like Pete Seeger and the Weavers, and the multiple gold record-producing group the Kingston Trio. The folk music scene of the late 1950s and early 60s had become a little tense, however, with a division between artists who felt that the message of the music was more important than any commercial success it might achieve, and the record industry executives who were, of course, quite concerned about keeping those dollars flowing. Bert Grossman had the idea that if he could build a group with youthful good looks and a non-threatening demeanor, well, they could make the subtly political messages that most songs carried in those days a bit more acceptable to the record-buying public, not to mention public officials cast in the nervous mode of Joseph McCarthy. So Grossman put out the word that he was looking for singers, and relatively quickly discovered Peter Yarrow, who would become the first member of Grossman's new act. While they were meeting at a Greenwich Village establishment known as Israel Young's Folklore Center, Yarrow noticed a picture on the wall, a young blonde singer from Kentucky who had found some work backing up Pete Seeger's band. "Hey, who's that?" Yarrow asked. "Oh, well, that's Mary Travers," Grossman responded. "She'd be great if you could ever get her to work." Yarrow stopped by her apartment, asked her if they could harmonize a little bit on a popular song of the time, Miner's Lifeguard by Pete Seeger. They did, and she liked it, and Mary became the second addition to the group. But what about that third member? Grossman knew a singer named Dave Van Ronk, and at one point offered him the job after a brief audition. Van Ronk thought it over, but decided to decline. So Mary Travers recommended a guy by the name of Noel Stuckey, who was performing stand-up comedy and songs at the Gaslight Cafe. Since they had narrowly missed out on being Peter, Ronk, and Mary, and also since Noel just didn't seem to roll right off the tongue, they went with Stuckey's middle name and called the group Peter, Paul, and Mary. They rehearsed together for about 6 months and then debuted at the Bitter End nightclub late in 1961. Their first album, also called Peter, Paul, and Mary, hey, why argue with success, hit the top 10 and stayed there for 10 months, eventually selling more than 2 million copies. The trio was a huge hit, and they toured extensively to rave reviews and ever larger crowds. Peter, Paul, and Mary didn't write their own songs in the early days. Instead, Grossman had them using the material of established songwriters like Seeger. There was one young songwriter on Grossman's staff that toiled in relative obscurity, honing his craft and waiting for his, hopefully, big moment. Nobody had ever heard of Bob Dylan in 1963. And not many people had ever heard any of his songs either, as he was struggling to make it on the folk music club scene. But Grossman had an idea, and he had programmed his new stars, Peter, Paul, and Mary, to close out the Newport Folk Festival on a Friday night. This guaranteed a pretty nice crowd, and the trio dutifully performed their hits to the delight of one and all. Then Grossman and his partner, George Wine, took a chance, and they brought young Dylan to the stage, after telling the crowd that Peter, Paul, and Mary would return for the finale. Dylan let loose with soon-to-be classics like With God on Our Side, Talkin' John Birch Society, and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. And then history happened, with maybe a little dose of magic mixed in too. Peter, Paul, and Mary came back on and performed another one of Dylan's songs, Blowin' in the Wind. The crowd erupted, and several stars were born. Blowin' in the Wind became the trio's top-selling song of all time. It sold 300,000 copies in the first week, and this was way, way, way before iTunes, remember? 2 months later, more than 1 million singles had been sold. Dylan was reportedly stunned with his cut of the publishing rights, $5,000. And the rest, as they say, is history. I'm a little stunned myself that I was able to find 8mm footage from the Newport Festival in 1963. So folks, just sit back, listen, and enjoy. Here's the first ever performance of Blowin' in the Wind by Peter, Paul, and Mary. The words and music by Bob Dylan.
Must a
This has been another episode of Jazzed About History. I'm your host, John Fairless. Just a note that all images, artwork, music, and other material are used under the Creative Commons license on YouTube and are intended only as fair use for the purpose of information and entertainment. Do you have a favorite historical moment you'd like for us to feature? Send us an email at jazzedabouthestory@gmail.com.